All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tilman Lueder, recently appointed head of the asset management unit. No, no, exactly not, actually. The other way around, the securities markets unit. And I have started my job in a very promising note with this proposal. This proposal started in the summer. We did an impact assessment in record time, and then we presented a proposal in November, and I think that it's fair to say that we wouldn't have done a better proposal even if you would have given us another year or even longer, because what needs to be done, and that's the main point, what needs to be done here is pretty straightforward. The prospectus is a document which gives you access to the capital markets, but it should be really a document that is read. It should be a document that investors appreciate, and it should give you true access to the capital market. It should not be a playground for lawyers, and I'm a lawyer myself, so I can say this in a self-critical manner. This is not a document written for one lawyer to another lawyer. This is not a legal memorandum. This is not an endless risk analysis. This is really a document which should give key information in a concise form. Now, I'm trying to, in my introduction, give you an answer to the key discussion points that the organizer, whom I thank, of course, for having invited me, put out there as the key question, and I will give you my preliminary answer. So discussion point number one is this a proposal which has the potential to create a single market for investments? And I would say yes. And I would say yes for something which has maybe not been stressed so much in the previous debate, and that is that this is a multi-layered proposal, and this proposal does not pursue a single ideology saying that every single cross-border offering must have a prospectus and that every single cross-border offering is only possible with a harmonized prospectus. Because as the rapporteur, Philippe de Backer, has already hinted, there are interesting components to this proposal which shows that we have truly understood what the internal market is, and that is also not just having a free movement of capital on the basis of harmonized document, that is also, to a large extent, mutual recognition. And that is what really happens in that zone below the 10 million. In that zone below 10 million, member states are free to have adequate disclosure documents, which is at their discretion what they consider to be adequate. And if you have, for instance, and that is something which has not been mentioned so much, so I'll give you an example. You have two member states, A and B, and they both are like-minded in the sense that they both apply this 10 million threshold, and they both have disclosure documents which they think of each other are mutually compatible. There's nothing then that would hinder you to raise capital across borders between those two member states. And that is why we're getting rid of, and the rapporteur has pointed to this already, that is why we're getting rid of this unfortunate formulation in the current draft that if you are below 10 million, you have to confine your offer to one member state. That was a bad formulation. The lawyers, typically again, they wanted to go a bit on the safe side. That's not what we meant. What we meant with this is to say that below 10 million, you will not be able to use the notification process in Article 24. That means you will not have a passportable prospectus. But as I said, cross-border capital raising is not only with the prospectus and with the passport. We have created a zone beneath the prospectus threshold where you can raise capital across national borders if both member states apply a certain threshold and if both member states recognize their disclosure documents amongst themselves. And that's a very important point. The other alternative, which Philippe just mentioned, is of course to create another simpler harmonized document. I would argue that indeed, as Philippe seemed to have hinted now, the current SME document would probably fit that bill. We don't have to have yet another light touch disclosure system. I think we could build on the current SME and use that to fill the gap. And then you again would have a light touch prospectus, and that would be the other ideology. That would be the ideology that capital can only be raised on the basis of a harmonized document. And yet again, I would argue both of these can coexist. We could have a light touch prospectus for those who want to use this, but please do not interpret this as a precondition that no capital could be raised across borders if some other disclosure document existed and if member states and their competent authorities decided amongst themselves to recognize this and to say that you can use this document in my territory to raise capital with investors as well. I think that's a very important point. I've been doing this single market business since 1992, and this is how we started, with mutual recognition. So we are going to a certain extent back to the roots. There will be mutual recognition for certain issuances, and in the alternative, there will also be possibly a light touch prospectus. And then for the big boys, for those who raise capital to above 10 million or above 20 million, that needs to be negotiated. There will then indeed be the harmonized prospectus, because these are the kind of sums which do require a uniform level of investor protection across the EU. So yes, questions number 1 and 2, I think we can answer them in the positive. Yes, it will create a single market. It will use several tools to do so. And yes, it will not imperil investor protection, because investors still will get, for the big issuances, the harmonized prospectus, but for the small issuances, we do have to leave it to the member state that possibly they could recognize disclosure amongst themselves, because they are closest and they know what the investors need to know, what are the typical risks. Third question, is the threshold of 500,000 set at the right level? I think we can argue about this. We wanted to create this total prospectus-free zone for crowdfunding. If nowadays you say that the ticket sizes of crowdfunding have increased and we should go for 1 million, that's certainly something which will crystallize in the course of the co-decision negotiations. Fourth question, would member states be able to set a higher threshold? That's a very interesting question. So we decided at 10 million because we thought that, yes, that is kind of the budget size of an SME. Yes, that is something where we could live either with a light touch prospectus or where we would say that mutual recognition is perfectly sufficient. There are some voices claiming that we should go higher. We should go for 20 million. Conceptually, there is some sympathy for this. The downside is that we would then have many smaller member states who essentially don't have the prospectus anymore, because that is the issuance sizes that usually prevails on these territories. So please consider that although from a big member state perspective, 20 million might seem very attractive. From a small member state perspective, you would essentially have to admit that my country is a prospectus-free zone. Others may or may not recognize the documents that I foresee for cross-border capital raising. Of course, there is the opt-in that Philip already mentioned. We constructed the opt-in precisely for the purpose of having a bit of scope to go and increase the threshold. I have been told by member states' representatives, and I have some sympathy for this, that we would then somehow be a second-class issuer. We would have second-class issuers in our territory because they would all have to opt in, and somehow there is some discomfort. I just want to signal this. That is why the Commission, although wanting to be extremely ambitious and wanting to create a true zone for mutual recognition or light touch prospectuses, was a bit prudent in going above 10 million. Now, the SME prospectus is indeed, and that is what already was mentioned, there is a difficult balance to be struck between the level 1 and the level 2, as we say in the jargon. That is essentially how deep do we go into details of the SME format at the legislative level. Some say we don't go deep enough, but then every time, of course, the question comes up, well, what should we put into the so-called level 1? So in the primary legislation, we've tested that recently. Well, then you get a sort of Christmas list, and then we're not quite sure whether we would actually get a light touch prospectus, because everybody comes and says, yes, but you overlooked this, and couldn't we put in this, and I think that their cash flow statement is important, and it's a bit ambitious to only have 1 year of financial information, maybe have 2, and that is exactly the dilemma. We have to sort it out at some stage, either at level 1 or level 2. I think that we are not ideologically predisposed to either one of them. But the risk, of course, here is that we would not get at the end a streamlined prospectus if we had this wish list approach. So we really need to be very focused on what we want to achieve, and there is some promising language out there which we are currently discussing. You should have some minimum requirements. Why are you raising the capital? What are you going to do with the capital? How is it going to influence your capital structure? And maybe some basic information about you as the issuer, and that should be it. So if we could find some balance on what this SME light touch prospectus should look like and enshrine it in level 1, that's fine. But the risk, of course, is that we should not lose focus, that it should remain a light touch document. And then finally, I want to say something about advertising, because that wasn't mentioned yet, and that is an integral part of the internal market. We have never managed in anything I've previously administered in my Commission career to have harmonized rules on marketing. We don't have harmonized rules on marketing for funds. We don't have harmonized rules for nothing, basically, because, well, that's it. That's the truth. We have unfair competition rules in the different member states. We have minimum requirements on advertising standards. Here in Belgium, la concurrence déloyale. I come from a country which loves this kind of stuff. There's all kinds of consumer protection which is not linked to the actual content of the prospectus being somehow misaligned with the actual contents of the marketing material, rather somehow being misaligned with the prospectus content or being misleading when measured against the benchmark of the prospectus, because that I think we could harmonize. But there are lots of other marketing rules out there which have nothing to do with particular issuances or with particular financial products, which are just general marketing rules, and we've never actually managed to harmonize those. And some would argue nowadays we shouldn't actually harmonize those. But the issue remains, if we don't, then of course a lot of the benefit of having the prospectus, a lot of the benefit of having a single home regulator who approves the whole package, tripartite or whatever version you have, it's always one home member state. And suddenly you go out there and you want to raise capital in a variety of hosts, and some of these hosts contact you and say, well, that's not enough that you have a prospectus. You also have to register at the host member state level because we need to monitor your compliance with a variety of local advertising rules. And then some of the companies and some of the issuers have come to see us and said, well, what's the point then of the prospectus if we have to replicate all of the host registration just for the purposes of being supervised in our advertising? There is a huge problem out there. We try to address it by saying that even the advertising material by the issuer should be approved in one central stage by the home. Criticism has been harsh, criticism has been loud. My God, the home doesn't speak all the languages. The home wouldn't even understand certain language versions. Are you asking the home to rubber stamp these language versions? The home isn't familiar with the local investment culture. All kinds of reasons have been advanced. But the problem remains, and I accept some of these reasons, but the problem remains if you give the advertising competence, if you give the competence to supervise advertising to the host, you are partially invalidating the benefit of the single document, the prospectus. And that is something which we, as the European Commission, we are still there to protect the internal market. We are still there that people trade more with each other. We are not harmonizing the prospectus just because we like harmonized documentation and we find some intellectual pleasure that from Portugal up to Finland they're using the same document. The reason is that we want people to trade with each other, that we want people to raise capital in each other's territories, and we need to address this advertising question. I'm looking forward to debate on this. I've signaled it to you, Philippe. Yep. That is a big, big issue, and we haven't yet found the optimal equilibrium. Thank you very much.